Maggie didn't manage to sleep quickly at night. She was very anxious and nervous because tomorrow she had a wedding with her favorite man, Dan. Maggie still finds it hard to believe that her dream was become a reality. But a couple days ago, a subtle sense of unease settled in her soul, and it's only grown with each passing day. When Maggie told her friend about it, she didn't take her words seriously. I know what you mean, honey. I mean, weddings are so exciting. I too was terribly nervous at one time, and even cried when the groom was late for the ceremony. I always thought that he would run away at the last moment, she said, and they laughed together. The morning of that day, Maggie felt nervous clearly. On top of that, she had a nightmare. She didn't remember the details, but it was clearly a warning of something bad. The first thing she did was call her fiancé Dan and share her mood. He simply reassured her. Honey, I'm very nervous too. This is a very important event in our lives. I've checked the preparations for the ceremony. Everything should be fine. And I advise you not to think about anything but your upcoming night of love, he said. Toward dinner, Maggie looked in the mirror and saw the most beautiful bride in the world. All of her guests were talking about it too. The card to the ceremony side was on time. All the guests were in full force, and even Dan, who was always late, arrived first today and waited for his bride at the altar. Well, honey, are you ready for the start of our ceremony? Dan asked. I don't understand why my daddy is late, and Melinda still hasn't arrived with my baby brothers. She was worried. A couple minutes later, Maggie got a phone call. On the other end of the line, she got some disappointing news. You have a call from City Hospital. Alan Davis has been admitted with burns. According to our information, he received them during work hours when he was fighting a fire in one of the residential buildings. His condition is stable, they told her. Maggie almost cried. Dan, too, sensed there was trouble, but the bride was not distraught. She made a couple of claps with her palm to draw the guest's attention to herself. My nearest and dearest, there has been an accident in our family, and worst of all, my father will not be able to attend this event, and it is. I refuse to take the most important step of my life without him. Please forgive me and go home. There will be no wedding, she declared. The guests murmured and whispered among themselves. Dan was at the complete loss. He wished the wedding could go ahead, but Maggie was already taking off her veil and hurrying to the clinic. In the commotion, an older, obese woman came up to Dan and pulled him aside, taking his hand. He was no father to her. She's just been living off him all her life. There have been so many scandals about it. I feel sorry for Alan's wife. She's been through so much between Alan and Maggie. Anyway, you figure it out. Good luck with that. Just so long as it don't say anything to do, said the fat woman, and then blended into the crowd of guests. Maggie sat in the lobby of the city clinic until late afternoon. The girl in the wedding dress attracted the attention of all the visitors, but she didn't care about the others. She only prayed that Alan will be alive. Near midnight, the doctor convinced her to go home. Dan insisted, and when she finally arrived home, Dan decided to talk to his fiancée about what the obese woman had told him. Oh, Aunt Sarah, it's as usual, Maggie gasped. If you're really interested in this story, I'm I'm ready to tell it, she added, then took her hand and sat down beside her. That evening, Maggie took a trip back to her troubled childhood, which she had not liked to do before. So Dan heard the following from his fiance's lips. For as long as I remember, my own father and my late mother did not get along. There were scandals at home almost every day. As a 5 years old girl, I dream of going somewhere else and never coming back to that house. All because of the scandals between my parents. My dad blamed my mom for something of his own. She was always unhappy with him and threw tantrums. I had to hear it all. Sometimes they could fight all night long. Instead of sleeping, all I did was cry into my pillow. So when my mom told me that we were leaving my dad, I was glad. My mom packed our things and she and I moved in with my grandma. My mom and grandmother were sure that a few days will pass and my dad will definitely come back for us. Grandma advised my mom to be tough when he came, but he never came. After a while, my mom started crying for him herself. I quickly forgot the scandals and missed Daddy too, but he never came. And so time passed. I started to go to school, get interested in music, but I did not forget my father. Every day when I left school, I saw my friends being followed by their fathers, and I couldn't even remember my father's face. My mom had gotten a job during this time. Now she had very little time for me, and my grandmother hated it when I was at home. Everything I did annoyed her. Even if I sat quietly in the back room, she would find a reason to scold or punish me. Sometimes I thought we'd better off at Daddy's house. And so the years went by. One day, a strange man came to my grandmother's house and introduced himself as my uncle. His name was Martin. He was horrible. Grandma said Martin will live with us. The very next day, my uncle came home drunk and started punishing me for not knowing how to cook food. Mom wasn't home. I had to endure his educational measures for several hours. He was cruel. In the evening, I told my mom everything. She listened to me carefully and promised that everything would change soon. After a while, Mom and I had a serious conversation. Maggie, you're a big girl. I think you will understand me correctly. I've met a good man. He's asked me to marry him. If you don't mind, you and I can move in with him, he said. This news was shocking to me. I couldn't imagine any other man beside my mom except my father. But from her words, the only thing that reasoned in my soul was move in with him. I was willing to do anything not to put up with my uncle's educational measures. I silently nodded my head and approved my mom's decision. Within a week, my mom and I were already settled in someone else's house. That evening, my mom cooked dinner, and I saw her choosing one for the first time. He was just an ordinary guy. I'll be honest, I didn't like him right away. Hi, Alan greeted me coldly. I didn't feel like answering him. I sat down at the table and watched this unassuming man who looked at my mom with burning eyes. Alan worked at the lifeguard, playing soccer on weekends, sat in front of TV in the evenings with a bottle of beer, and nothing more to say about him. That's how my new life began. Alan and I hardly spoke to each other. Even at the same time, I realized that there was no little joy in life. To get my mind off the things, I get absorbed in my violin lessons. Why didn't I hang out with Alan? Because I was afraid of him. When I first saw Uncle Martin, for some reason I thought he'd be as kind to me as my father, but I was quickly disappointed. I didn't want to experience the same thing with Alan. I knew he meant so much to my mom. Over time, I noticed that Alan and my mom almost never fought. We lived a very quiet and peaceful life. Sometimes Alan, when he came home from work in the evenings, would barely audibly greet me, but I'd never answer him. My mother had called me many times for a frank conversation and asked me why I felt that way about him. I had no answer to that question. I just shrugged my shoulders and preferred to live my inner life. I don't think Alan cared either, whether I socialized with him or not. It went on like that for a few years. In those few years, I only noticed one unpleasant incident. It had to do with this obese woman at my wedding. Her name is Sarah. She's Alan's neighbor. She dislikes my mom from the beginning. One day she came out to our house, stand in the kitchen and told my mom something. Are you naive? Or are you so stupid? Don't you notice that your husband is obviously partial to that hottie who lives upstairs? She's purposely walking around in front of him, flaunting her charms. Alan, when he's a man, he will fall for it. She's a nice girl. She could easily steal him away from you. You need to think about where you're going to live with your daughter when your husband kicks you out of the house, she said. After listening to Sarah, I felt that I hate Alan. Now I understand why I don't want to talk to him. He's just not a good person. He cheats on my mom. He's traitor. I was worried about my mom. Once again, she had to think about where we'll live next. But my mom surprised me with her answer. Let her. A real man will always look up to women. I don't argue. The new neighbor is very beautiful, and my husband is clearly her type. If Alan decides to get serious with her, I won't stand in their way. When those times come, then I will think about how and where to live. And Sarah, I suggest you watch your husband and your children, or they may start looking at someone else, and you will not notice it. My mom said and laughed at her. Sarah left us unhappy. I knew my mom fell. If it had been my own father instead of Alan, she would have thrown the usual tantrum. But with Alan, she behaved very differently. She wouldn't even discuss the matter with him. We just carried on as normal. When I was 14, one day my mom gave me some sad news. Maggie, I'm going to have to work in a neighboring town for a couple of months. It's important for my career advancement. I'm thinking about your future. I want you to get a good education, and for that I need to work hard, she said, and I had nothing to say against it. I just knew that in the next 2 months I will be very bored. I didn't think about anything else. My mom packed my things. Alan walked her to the train station. I went to school as usual, and after school, I attended violin lessons. In the evenings, Alan cooked a tasty dinner for the two of us, and I didn't eat it. Then he just ordered ready meals. He left my portion on the table in the kitchen, and he ate in front of the TV. We still had nothing to talk about. A week after my mother's departure at the music school, I was offered to participate in a competition. I liked that idea. I started practicing different compositions. I must say that my rehearsals have always been a problem for others. When a novice performer plays the violin for a long time, not every person can stand it. First of all, I was afraid that Alan would get angry, but he never made any remarks about it. One evening, I was practicing a new composition on the violin as usual. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the apartment door. I went and opened it. Standing on the doorstep was my neighbor Sarah. Alan, for God's sake, take pity on us, your neighbors. Tell that little witch to put her villain away and give us some peace, she shouted from the doorstep. I knew there will be a scandal now, but Alan came up to her and said, Sarah, please come down. The girl's got a pigeon to prepare for. If you're not feeling well, I can give you earplugs. Or you can be patient somehow, he said. Sarah left us angry and hurt again. She didn't look in on us for a long time after that. I won an honorable place in the competition. They gave me a trophy. I brought it home and put it on the window sill. I never thought I'd show it to Alan, but he noticed it, twirled it in his hands, looked at me and said, Congratulations, Maggie. You did great. I just nodded my head and didn't say another word. In those days, I looked forward to my mother's return, but I didn't realize that I will never see her again. A terrible thing happened in our lives. One evening, Alan received a phone call telling him to come to the hospital immediately. He didn't return from the hospital until the morning. He was devastated. Immediately, relatives began to gather at our house. They all looked at me with pity and could not hold back their tears. A friend of my mother's came up to me. Baby, you hang in there. Your mom's going to heaven. Sometimes it happens in life, but you're very strong. You will get through this, she said and hugged me. I didn't want to believe that my mom was gone, but gradually I had to accept it. Later, we'll learn the details on what happened. The offended Sarah called my mother one evening and told her that there was a fire in our apartment. My mom immediately got in the car and headed home. Scared for our lives, she drove at high speed. On the way, she lost control and crashed into a tree. Her injuries were incompatible with life. When Alan asked Sarah why she did it, she said she just wanted peace from my rehearsals. After the funeral, I was a wreck. I was sitting on the balcony in the kitchen. Alan was talking to my grandmother and Uncle Martin. I don't mind, of course, but I think the girl will be better off with their relatives, Alan said. I realized that he was talking about me. Only my children will live in my house, and I don't want anyone else. I don't want her in my house, replied Uncle Martin, and they left. A couple of days later, Alan called me for a serious talk. I already knew what it would be about, and even prepared my decision. You don't have to worry about me. I will go to an orphanage. I don't want to oppress anyone, I said. No, you can stay here. I will try to get custody of you. After I know how your relatives react, it won't be hard for me to do that, Alan said. I was serious about a new life at the orphanage, but Alan was against it. So I stayed at his place. It was boring, but still hardly spoke to each other. Eventually, he drew up the papers and became my legal guardian. 6 months later, he brought a strange woman into the house. Melinda, honey, I'd like you to meet Maggie, my daughter. I really want you two to be friends, he said. I could tell by the look in Melinda's eyes that she wasn't in the mood to be friends with me. I didn't really want to be friends with her either, but Alan surprised me by saying, My daughter. A few days later, Melinda moved in with her things. We started living together. A short time later, I witnessed Melinda's break the news to Alan. Honey, we're finally going to have a baby of our own. I'm so happy, she said. Ellen was happy too, but I didn't care about any of it. Melinda and I didn't get along right from the start. During the pregnancy, she acted like a mad woman, always angry, especially at me, throwing temper tantrums. But Alan put it out with it. I was 16 by then. As usual, I found solace in music school. One day, while playing in the orchestra, I felt sick. My eyes went black. Then I had tinnitus, and I collapsed to the floor. When I opened my eyes, I found myself in the medical center. Alan, my artistic director, and the doctor were there. So, he was raging at Alan. Look at your daughter, she's almost transparent. I've been watching her for a long time. She hardly eats anything in a day at school. How can you treat a teenager like that? As we drove home, Alan asked me how it happened. I hated to complain to him, but he was persistent. Then I told him that the money he used to leave for me on the nightstand had long since been taken by Melinda, and he was very upset. Why didn't you say anything to me, daughter? I will have fixed it. Melinda is going through a rough patch right now, but with the birth of the baby it will pass, he said. For the second time in my life, hearing the word daughter made me cry. From that day on, the money problem was solved. We were all waiting for the arrival of a new member of the family, but it was no without its challenges. Melinda gave birth to a very weak baby, and after her birth, she fell into a coma. Alan brought home a screaming little bundle. I looked at it and didn't know what to do with it. Ellen was even more confused. I was only 16, and I had never cared for an infant before. But Alan and I had somehow learned how to do it. Melinda's condition only got worse. It wasn't until 2 months later that she was able to return home. By then, baby Ronnie was awake and smiling all the time. From that day on, Melinda stopped harassing me, and we stopped fighting. 2 years later, I graduated from high school and was about to leave for another city. Then Alan came up to me, gave me some money and said, Maggie, my daughter, whatever you are, always remember that you have a family. You can depend on me for anything you need. That day I called him Daddy for the first time. He was touched, a little tearful even. Ever since that day, I've considered this wonderful man my father. No one can dispute that, because he raised me as his own daughter. And that's why I will love for him to be the one to walk me down the aisle. That's how Maggie finished her story. Dan put his arm around her, and that evening they just stayed silent. A week after Alan's accident, the doctors reported the good news. He was beginning to regain consciousness. When Alan opened his eyes, the first person he saw at the bedside was Maggie, with Melinda and Ronnie waiting eagerly outside the door. After a few more days, the doctor announced that Alan could now be discharged home. Maggie ran to the clinic again, but this time full of joy. In her hand was a beautiful paper bundle with an elegant ribbon. She held it out to Alan and said, Daddy, this is a new invitation to the wedding. We cancelled it last time. So what kind of wedding can it be without you? No excuses this time. Dan and I were just waiting for you, Maggie said. On the appointed day, everything worked out just the way it should. A year later, Maggie and Dan gave him grandfather status with a daughter of their own.